Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So now, in the last couple of days, we've been working on New Zealand for George V. And I wanted to take some time to explain the significance of perforations and watermarks and paper types on the stamps of this period. You'll see if you've had any experience with Scott and with Gibbons, you'll see that the Gibbons coverage of this period of New Zealand is much more extensive than what you see in Scott. And the reason for that is that Scott makes no distinction between the different paper types that were in use during this period. They do list the perforations and the basic watermark differences, but they don't list any of the paper types. So what I'm going to do in this video is explain a little better how to tell the difference between the three types of paper. De La Rue paper, Cowan paper, actually there's four types: Cowan paper, Jones paper, and Wiggins-Teape paper. Also, what I'm going to do is give you some tips on sorting the watermarks on the Pictorial issue of 1935. It's a little bit tricky to tell the difference sometimes between the single and the multiple watermark, and so I'm going to give you some pointers that will help you sort your stamps much more quickly and much more efficiently. So starting with the paper. So what's the significance of the different paper types? Well, many of the issues in the regular and back of the book sections are found on more than one type of paper. So in the main postage issues, the side faces that are typographed can be found on all four types of paper. Most of the values are not found on all four, but a few of them are. And in some instances, the difference is quite significant in terms of value. So, for example, the 1.5 penny chestnut George V stamp, I don't have an example of one here. Well, actually, no, I do here. Just hold on here. I've got a duplicate I can show you, just to show you what I'm talking about. Just let me haul one out here. Okay, so this stamp here. Okay, so that's a very common stamp for New Zealand for the George V period. But the common stamp is on the De La Rue paper, and it catalogs, I think, 20 pence in Gibbons. It's nothing. But on Cowan paper, that stamp catalogs 110 pounds in used condition. And if I'm not mistaken, used actually catalogs more than mint. So knowing the distinctions, knowing the paper types will be very, very helpful to you in terms of the value, determining the value of your collection. Some of the more common, in addition to the side faces, the 1923 map stamp comes on two types of paper, I think, if I'm not mistaken. The Admiral issue with George V wearing his headdress, that's this one here. I'm just going to find an example to show you. Okay, that would be this stamp. So you've got the high value stamp here, the 2 shilling, and then the 1 penny stamp that was in use, common use, which is Carmen. That stamp can be found on Cowan paper and on Wiggins-Teape paper. And the Cowan paper is the common one. I always check the Wiggins-Teape catalogs, I think about 10 or 15 pounds for a used single, which is fairly high given that the basic stamp is only a 10p stamp. I always check them whenever I get them, but I never find them. Still have to this day have never found one. The on the back of the book is where you see the most impact of these differences: the postage dues, the government life insurance stamps, the postal fiscals. All of those are found on all 3 to 4 types of paper. And in many cases, there's significant differences in catalog values from one paper type to the next, with usually the De La Rue paper being the common paper, but sometimes the Cowan paper is common. Jones is almost always better, or it's the same price, and Wiggins-Teape is almost always better. Now, how to tell the difference between them. I'm going to post a table in my tables section of the website, where will contain the written content of what I'm about to say. So you can always go back to it after. But I'm going to embellish a little bit on Gibbons's descriptions because I find them a little bit cryptic and hard to apply, especially if you only have one stamp and you're trying to identify the correct paper type without the benefit of any stamps to compare to. So Gibbons's description of Wiggins-Teape is straightforward. It's a vertical mesh paper. All the other papers of this period are horizontal mesh. So the way to check that is to just take the stamp. If you can see the grain, then the grain will tell you what direction the paper is, but you can also do, if you take it between your thumb and forefinger like this and bend it lightly in one direction, then turn it around and bend it the other way. So what you should see, depending on how, I just got to grab this here. Depending on the direction of the paper weave, you'll encounter more resistance in one direction than another. So the side that bends most easily is the direction of the weave. So here it bends most easily in the horizontal direction. If I try to bend it in the vertical direction, it's much stiffer. So this is a horizontal wove paper. And that means that's one of the 3 paper types: Jones, Cowan, or De La Rue. Now that particular set is only found on Cowan and Jones, so you have to look at other characteristics in order to correctly identify it. But Wiggins-Teape would be vertical wove, and so anytime you're sorting out the side faces or postage dues or government life insurance or postal fiscals, the first thing to do is to check to see which ones are vertical versus horizontal mesh. All the verticals are Wiggins-Teape. And you can separate those out accordingly. Okay, the only paper that's vertical mesh that's not Wiggins-Teape is on the very first Queen Victoria large side face postal fiscals. Those are usually a vertical mesh paper, but they are Cowan or the earlier basted Mills paper from the Queen Victorian period. So, okay, so then once you've ruled out and you've got the Wiggins-Teape paper, then how do you distinguish between De La Rue, Jones, and Cowan? So Cowan is the next most easy one to identify because when you turn it over, it should appear almost completely opaque. You won't be able to see the watermark through the paper when you place it down on a flat surface. You might just be able to make it out if you hold the stamp up to backlighting, a good strong backlight, but you will not generally be able to see it just from having the stamp face down. The paper also has quite a distinct mesh that's quite visible and appears to be a relatively high quality paper. The chalk surfacing on the felt side of the paper is complete, smooth, and doesn't have any real uneven areas or any roughness to it. And in that respect, it's the same as De La Rue. So, um, so when you're trying to determine which one is Cowan, I mean, the best way is just to look to see which stamps are opaque when you turn them face down, and which ones you can't see the watermark for. So when you take those out, you're now left with De La Rue and Jones. Now both Jones and De La Rue will show the watermark to some extent when the stamps are placed face down without the aid of watermark fluid. It won't necessarily be clear. You'll still have to dip the stamp. You may still have to hold it up to light to see the full watermark, but you can see very clearly that the stamp is watermarked. So to distinguish Jones from De La Rue, you have to look at the chalk coating under a magnifying glass. Now, Gibbons's description says that it's poorly surfaced and that the ink tends to peel. And I find that description somewhat impracticable because the vast majority of the Jones stamps that I've looked at don't show peeling ink. I mean, they can. The ink can slough off in parts of the design, but I've had many Jones paper stamps where the design is completely intact and there's no ink sloughing off. The poor surfacing comment is really the one to focus on. So when you look at De La Rue paper under magnification on the felt side, you see a chalk surface that's nice and smooth and complete with just minimal pores visible in the surface. But for the most part, it's smooth, covers the stamp, isn't rough, and is uniform across the surface of the stamp. The Jones paper, when you look at it under magnification, you can see some roughness and some very light flaking of the actual chalk coating itself. It doesn't have the smoothness that the De La Rue has. And that's how I determine it. It's a little tricky at first to recognize it, but that's really the best way to see it. Now, there are some instances of Cowan paper that have very similar surface characteristics to the Jones. So again, the best, most reliable identifier of Cowan paper is the opacity when you're looking at the stamps face down. So that gives you a good way to distinguish between the four paper types. And that will stand you in very good stead for, dealing with most of the issues that arise during the vast majority of the rain. Now, the last issue that you'll have to deal with is the pictorial issue. And there's the first set from 1935 to 36 is the single watermark. And then in 1936, they reissued the set with Watermark 98, which is the multiple star and NZ watermark. Now, you would think, just looking at that it should be easy to identify by dipping the stamps in fluid. Watermark 98, the multiple watermark, is a staggered watermark, which means that the different rows of the watermarks alternate so that the watermark in one row appears midpoint between two watermarks in the second row. So if you're able to get a stamp that shows two rows of watermarks, and you can see that they alternate in terms of their placement, then you've got a multiple watermark stamp. If you see two rows of watermarks, one above the other, that's the single watermark. The problem is when you dip some of the stamps in watermark fluid, there are times when you can only see one star in New Zealand. Or you see two watermarks, but you can't see the second row, so you can't tell if what you're looking at is multiple or single. At least you can't tell it with certainty. So one tip that I have found works 100% of the time is looking at the paper weave. So the stamps that are from the single watermark are all vertical wove stamps. In other words, they bend most easily in the vertical direction. The only exception to that being the 9p black and red. And there are some later printings on chalk surface paper that have vertical wove paper, but they're multiple watermark stamps. But other than that one stamp, and it's easy to distinguish because any printing on chalky paper is from the second set. But for all the other stamps, the best thing to do before you dip them is to do what I just showed you. So, here's a stamp from that set. That's the 8p. So, it is to just do this. If it's a multiple watermark stamp, it will bend easily in this direction. But as you can see, it bends the most easily vertically here. So this one is a single watermark stamp. And that's the easiest way to identify them. Of course, most of these stamps still exist with inverted watermarks. So when you're sorting your stamps, you still want to check the watermark. But if you pre-sort your stamps into piles based on how the direction of the paper weave is, then you can spend the rest of your time focusing on whether or not you have a watermark variety. But you're not trying to deal with the identification of the watermark itself, with fluid, because that can get to be cumbersome, and it's like I said, it's not always conclusive. Okay, so that sort of covers two main points on the papers and the watermark. Now, the other thing is the perforations. So on New Zealand stamps, the perforations are important as well. You see it more on the Pictorial issue and on the very first issues, the George V stamps, the engraved side faces, and some of the typograph stamps. The common perf in that period is 14 by 14 and a half, 14 by 13 and a half, and 14 line. Now, one thing that gets a little bit tricky, and it's important to use your Instanta gauge properly, using the guidelines and lining it up properly in your stamps, is because identifying correctly the difference between 14 and a half and 14 can get very tricky. And that's because the quoted measurements in the literature are not exact. So when Gibbons tells you that the stamp is 14 by 14 and a half, it's not really exactly 14 or exactly 14 and a half. It's somewhere in between. But they quote it or they round it up or down in order to make it simpler. So you can wind up, when you look at the measurements and you're looking at your stamps, you can get stamps that, where it's very difficult to tell which of those two perfs they fall into. And you have to take extra care when you're using your Instanta gauge to line everything up correctly in order to get an accurate reading. The other thing is paying attention to comb versus line will help greatly in terms of avoiding misidentifications. Scott typically doesn't discuss line versus comb perforating at all. It doesn't mention that, but the Gibbons listings do. And you have to understand the difference between the two if you're going to make a correct identification. So just to recap that, a line perforation is one in which the perforations are done sequentially in rows and columns like this. And so inevitably, when they perforate the sheet, when they go in one direction, you're going to get one set of holes. But when you go in the next direction this way, you're almost never going to have an instance where the holes line up at each intersection. You're going to potentially double punch out a hole, or you're going to punch very close to the holes going in this direction. You're not going to have even spacing around the corners of the stamp. And so when you have a line perforated stamp, you will not be able to take two stamps like here. If these were line perforated and you were to place them on top of one another, you would not be able to line them up on all four sides. You would notice, if you were looking at them, that the corners would appear to be somewhat uneven on at least one corner. Now, comb perforations, on the other hand, the perforations are in a comb, and they work like a guillotine. So you'd have a perforator that has all of your rows and columns already laid out. And so it simply comes down like this onto the sheet and perforates the whole thing in one pass. Or what sometimes happens is the comb will go down one part of the sheet, move up, the next part of the sheet, move up, next part of the sheet. So you might have 2 or 3 passes of a comb required to perforate the whole sheet. But in each case, what happens is the holes line up perfectly at the corners. They're always even, and you can put 2 comb perforated stamps. These are both comb perforated. So if you put one above the other, you can completely line them up. So here, I got to get the focus there, but you can see the perforations line up absolutely perfectly on all 4 sides. That's how you determine a comb perf stamp. And you'll notice in the Gibbons listings quite frequently, they will state whether something is line or comb perforated. So that's going to be very important for identifying some of these varieties correctly in the early period. So anyway, that's it for this video. My next one will look at Australia, look at the kangaroo and map stamps, and the George V heads. Thanks for watching. Bye.